Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing.
You let me know when we are live streaming, please. Great to know. Thank you. Item agenda 1, apologies from anywhere. I'm looking online here because there's quite a few. Okay. Councillor Hockeyan, I believe, is going to join us, but he's going to be late. I don't see any lights or anything, so we'll just move on to declarations of interest at this point because there's only one item on the agenda tonight. Has anyone any items or any declarations of interest? Again, I don't see any lights on, members. So coming up now to agenda item number 3, and the reason of tonight's meeting is that we are meeting with DFI Road Service officials. Can I welcome Mark McPeak, who is the Divisional Roads Manager, and Alan McMurray, who is the Network Maintenance Manager. This is in light of the letter that was circulated to ourselves back in August. Members requested this special meeting. Members, I want to reiterate to you tonight that we are not deviating away from tonight's meeting. It is to do with winter gritting, and I apologise in advance, but if you steer down a different avenue, I'm going to cut your mic. We are going for a meeting next month with DFI Roads. We have a clinic set up, and any issues that we raise will be raised then. So I do hope you appreciate that I'm trying to keep this curtailed to what the meeting is. There's 41 of us. We do have issues, as we all do, with DFI Roads, and I want to curtail for what tonight's meeting is about. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over. Is it Mark? Are you taking this? Okay, thank you. I get the right one.
Thank you. Nice to be here. I'm joined tonight with Alan McMurray, who is the Southern Division's maintenance engineer, who delivers our winter service operation. At the outset, I would like to explain that we fully appreciate the concerns of the public who use the more lightly trafficked roads which are not on the salted network, and the impact that this causes to them, including bus routes. Tonight gives us an opportunity to give a little more detail on the why, the what, and the how winter service is delivered, and and then to explain the significant budget pressures the department is currently facing. You may be aware that I issued a letter to Council recently that sets out a number of points, which I believe has been circulated to members. It's that letter that I'll be basing this short presentation on, so we're addressing many of those points. I should firstly like to explain why we salt roads. The primary reason is to sustain the economy during icy road conditions by allowing safe and free movement of traffic on selected routes. We do this by maximising our very limited resources to focus on main roads. It is also important to explain that salting is a discretionary function. In other words, there is no legal requirement for us to carry it out, and that there is a legislative obligation on drivers to drive with care in all road conditions, including ice and snow. Our policy sets out the criteria in terms of what we salt. This results in approximately 7,000 kilometres, equivalent to Belfast to Moscow and back, and amounts to about 28% of the network being salted, which carries approximately 80% of the traffic. Because of the significance of the operation and that it is a discretionary function, our policy has been set by previous ministers and an executive. Any significant change, including an expansion, would require it to be reset by them. The current approach being used is considered to be the best balance of cost and effectiveness, as well as maximising our very limited resources. I would add that we also provide over 5,500 salt bins and 58,000 salt piles on a self-help basis on a selection of roads that are not salted. The role of the 4 divisions is to deliver the operational element of the winter service policy across all 11 council areas. We really do understand the concerns that council has raised about salting the rural network, particularly bus routes, and the impact this can have on people's decisions to travel or not, and their safety. It is important to explain that for salt to act as a de-icer, it requires a considerable amount of traffic to break down the salt particles into a water solution before becoming effective. We know this from scientific data, but we have also become aware after receiving complaints about some lower traffic roads that are on the salted network and that have unmelted ice. Regrettably, roads and low traffic, such as many rural roads, salting has limited benefit and can be counterproductive when it comes to road safety, as it can create false sense of security for road users. It is regrettable that rural bus routes tend to have very low traffic, where salting would provide very limited benefit. The current salted network does include primary public transport corridors, these being the highest used routes. To include all bus routes such as other TransLink buses, school buses, healthcare buses, and so on, onto the salted network would be a significant increase on top of the current routes. Regardless of having little benefit, this would require a sizable increase in our fleet, drivers, and cost to deliver. The size of the operation would become impractical, unsustainable based on current resourcing levels. I would like to explain quickly how we deliver the already complex operation of winter service to the scheduled network. It takes 108 gritters to carry out one salting operation across Northern Ireland, which takes nearly 4 hours to complete. Decision-making and timing of a salting action is critical, and in the majority of cases, this needs done during the early hours of the morning. Sometimes salting actions are repeated up to 3 to 4 times in a 24-hour period. To deliver the current operation and to ensure rest periods, we have over 350 volunteer staff available for a 7-month period during the winter season. They also require specialist training. Our volunteer staff give up their time when the public are in bed. I would thank our volunteers who do an incredible job during the bleak early hours to keep our economy moving. We also have squads and depots to load vehicles, as well as ensuring they are well maintained throughout the year. It costs approximately 85,000 for one salting action, which on average amounts to approximately £7 million annually. To give a sense of what it would take to expand the salted network, to cover 90% of the traffic would double the annual cost to 14 million. To cover 100% of the network would double it again to 28 million. This is roughly equivalent to the whole of our current annual budget for road maintenance. We really do maximise our resources over 7 months of the year to deliver winter service. Expanding the current salted network, regardless of it being of benefit or impractical, would impact on us even further to maintain existing roads because of the funding and resources that would need to be taken away from an already underfunded limited service maintenance regime. It would simply not be practical for us to do any more winter service without a substantial increase in resources and funding. In terms of our current budget constraints, it would be remiss of me not to highlight the serious shortfall in resource funding that the department is currently facing. The department has 167 million of resource funding pressure this year. Following a public consultation of a quality impact assessment to assess the impacts of our resource spending, that included an option for stopping the discretionary function of salting the road network, as well as the potential switching off streetlights and reducing road maintenance further. The department published an interim consultation report in July, which recognised the impact of reduction of winter service in all road users and the impact on the Northern Ireland economy. It is also recognised that making such decisions is not within the power to take under the Executive Forum Act. To summarise, again, we fully understand and appreciate the concerns of those who use roads that are not on the treated network. However, it is simply not practical to expand the salted network beyond its parameters And in fact, with current resourcing and funding challenges, the department is actually looking to reduce it. I would also say that the department's current position on winter service remains unchanged, and that has been reiterated by both Colin Woods, our Deputy Secretary, and the Permanent Secretary, Julie Harrison, earlier in the year. We would advise those who live on the rural unsalted network to be very careful, slow down, and leave extra time for the journey. Thank you. That concludes my explanation.
Mark, thank you for that, and trying to keep it as condensed as and easy to understand as possible. And Mark, can I also join with you? 750 volunteers. I don't know that I did not realise that we had that amount of people across the area helping with the gridding process. So I want to also place on record our thanks on behalf of the council for the work that they do. Councillor McClelland, you have not ceased writing since Mark started speaking, so I'm dreading what's coming up.
Lord Mayor, thank you, and certainly welcome to Mark and Alan. And I would say, whilst we're staying on the winter gridding issues for this evening, there'll be plenty coming up next week, the next time that we meet you guys. So just be prepared, be warned, be whatever. But anyway, as you probably know, the Lagan River DEA is probably the most rural of all of the DEAs within this council area. And I suppose Bridge, which in Northern Irish weather terms is sometimes described as the coldest or maybe the second most coldest place within Northern Ireland, is in the Lagan River DEA. Which I suppose brings me on to the school bus route, and you mentioned school bus routes there, Mark, in your presentation, and the road between Catesbridge and Kinallen not only has one secondary school bus route, but it has two, namely Dromore High School and Banbridge Academy. You know, it's all very well, Mark, saying that you're particularly concerned about school bus routes, but that's all very well. But when you picture a scenario in the morning, a family have the kids ready, it's frosty on an ungridded road, and the school bus doesn't appear, that immediately sends that, or has the potential to send that family into orbit in terms of having to change the routine. It can sometimes mean that the kids don't make school. It can mean that the parents have to change their routines and so on in terms of doing the school run and then going on to work. So it's all very well saying that there's particular concern, but really I'm not sure even that any of us realise the deep issues that a school bus not running because of a road that is ungridded. You know, I don't think that any of us really understand that. So I would say, you know, well, I would ask the question, you know, yes, you're concerned, but really what's been done about it? And I suppose the other thing that I would raise, and yes, I did hear that that to vastly increase the amount or the running mileage of roads that are gridded would take vast sums of money. I accept that, but there as an example, Skake Road, Kinallen, from the 30-mile limit up to the Banbridge Road, there are literally hundreds of families that are affected by that small stretch not being gridded. And it means that they can't get up onto Banbridge Road and go their way either towards Lisburn or towards Banbridge in the mornings. A very small area of road that would make a huge difference to a lot of my constituents in Craigavon. And I suppose I would just finish off by saying, you know, I would ask you to reflect on what I've said, Mark. And yes, it's grand to be particularly concerned, but I'll repeat myself, what's going to be done about it?
Thank you, Councillor McClelland. And Mark, there's two questions there. Can you pick up on both of those questions?
Thanks, Councillor McClelland. As I've set out in my presentation, the department is not proposing to expand its gridded or change its policy. In fact, the department isn't able to change its policy because it's set by previous ministers and the executive. We will continue to try and put in place the criteria of the policy, but the criteria needs to be met until for the route to become part of the gridded network. Now, we believe the gridded network currently meets the criteria. In terms of what's being done, we don't believe we can do anything more than what we're doing already. It's extremely difficult to expand the current service and the level of service that we're providing. It is extremely complex to deliver 28% of the network. To expand it, not just to this council area, but to 10 others, would mean a complete significant increase in the number of routes that need salted. We wouldn't have the fleet. We wouldn't have the people. We wouldn't have the storage for salt. We would need to replenish much more often. We don't have the money. We're not even funded at the start of this year currently. So we haven't got confirmation of funding yet for this year. Winter service is supposed to start on the 1st of October. So at the moment, we're aiming to deliver the current level of service that we provided in the past for many years. And we're aiming to do that to the best of our ability and hoping that our people are available to drive gridders, not just throughout the night, but throughout a 24-hour period during the day. What is being done, regrettably, it's not possible to expand or change the policy. We will continue to monitor any roads that may need to come onto the network to establish whether we have missed one, for example. But I think that's unlikely. Your second question, I believe, is, do we expand the services? I think I've answered it, that I don't think it's possible to expand the services, regrettably.
Okay. Well, I see you nodding at me there, Councillor McClelland. Do you accept the feedback? Not content with it or happy with it, but you accept the response? Thank you. Councillor Alexander.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Yeah, just really following on there. And again, to say I'm a little disappointed that we can only raise issues around the winter gritting. We have quite a few issues and we'll look forward to raising those in October. I'll just pick up on one thing you said quickly. You said we can't change the policy because there's no minister in place, but in your initial presentation you mentioned looking to reduce the service further. But if we can't change it, how can we reduce it? And then if we can reduce it, how will that be decided? What threshold will, who will make that decision if there isn't a minister? What will the threshold, essentially change to? What roads will be cut? I think these are all open questions that need to be answered. But, it would be good to understand, even if you can't give us the answer right now, what the potential process might be. On the ungridded roads, 72% of roads, as you said, are ungridded. Do we have any mitigating actions whatsoever for unsalted roads? are there any plans in place to improve safety on those roads that aren't gridded? Are there alternates to salt that, you know, have been considered? You know, maybe lowering speed limits temporarily, things like that, you know, during the winter. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in this. This is why you're here answering the questions, but I'm just trying to think of ways that on 72% of the road network, is there a way that we can improve the safety on these, you know, on these roads in these areas? As well as that, I mean, budget constraints aren't something that are unique to DFI. So it's really just about trying to maximize what, you know, I mean, essentially what you've got. So are there cost saving measures that are being put in place? Are there things that we're looking at to try and improve the efficiency of the service? Are there, you know, contingencies being set aside for future seasons? You know, I'm just trying to think of creative ways that DFI could potentially save money in the long run by being smart with the way that they deliver the service, as opposed to just sort of plodding forward with kind of business as usual. Those would be the 3 points I'd like to raise. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Alexander. And there's actually a lot of very good points raised there. Mark, did you get them all? Now, if you miss any, I'll come back to you, Councillor Alexander, and we can pick them up. So I'll pass over to yourself, Mark.
I'll try. Some very good questions. Firstly, I think there's 3 questions. The process to reduce. In the letter that I sent out on the 9th of August, I have attempted to explain the process. So what the department did in May is set out, because of the pressure on the budget, set out an EQIA, public consultation document, with the possibility of reducing winter service. And I think it was about converting winter service, the normal gridded routes, to emergency service only, or snow clearance. The department has published its interim consultation report based on that feedback. It was published in July, and there's a link in the letter to explain that process. It also, part of that consultation, and I'm not going off track, it was about the possibility of switching off streetlights and reducing further our road maintenance policy. So the department is in a significant challenging period in terms of costs. As civil servants, our duty is to work within the budget that's available to us. But at the moment, this year, the outlook is that we won't be able to do that. And this consultation process was about trying to seek views from the public on the potential of reducing services to try and meet that goal of. Now, you made a very good point. We can't change the policy. You're right, can't. And the letter explains that the power of senior officials, we don't have the power under the Northern Ireland Executive Forum Act to actually make that change, and we cannot lawfully do it in the absence of appropriate decision makers. So only if, when the decision makers come back, that's a minister or an executive, can the policy be changed, either reduced, or if someone wanted to decide to spend more and provide more fleet and more people to provide that extra service. But ultimately, Colin Woods, our Deputy Secretary, has said openly on a number of media interviews, Northern Ireland can have whatever quality of road network it wants, but it needs paid for. That's the first question. Unsalted roads. You're right. I touched on it briefly in my explanation. The department does produce or put in place 5,500 salt bins, and we have 58,000 grit piles on roads that qualify under the criteria of the policy in certain conditions. So that's a mitigating measure that people can use those on a self-help basis that to help salt the public road network in their local area. Now, there are issues with that. There's an awful lot of replenishing to do after a cold snap. Many salt piles, many salt bins are emptied after 2 days. And I think I'd be here a couple of years ago and I said, it takes 8 weeks, 8 squads, 8 weeks to replenish the division. So we can't go out the next day and just replenish everything. So there's significant resource challenges on our side to do that. Lowering speed limits, good idea, regrettably not. Lowering speed limits requires legislation. It takes probably a year, 6 months to a year to put that legislation in place. So it's not possible. There is a statistic though, that Alan raised this with me today. Actually, I didn't know that actually because people are more cautious on frosted roads that are untreated, there tends to be less accidents, injury collisions on the roads that are gridded. So that's where the, having a false sense of security of a road that is gridded and actually it being very, very low trafficked, when in fact a low traffic road that is gridded doesn't necessarily mean it's for frost or ice free. And that's the science behind it's not economical, minimal benefit to actually begin to salt more of the rural network because it effectively is ineffective. Cost savings, I'll say a bit, I'm going to ask Alan, but there is continual review of what can we do more and better and do things more efficiently. A good example of that is the route optimization study that was done along with the Met Office to work out statistically how can we grit the most road with our salt and gritting fleet and people. So that optimization study has been done. There's very technical computer equipment in each of the lorries, the gritters, to allow to ensure that the actual network is gridded to a certain point, and that when each, how do I explain this? Alan explained it better than me, to make sure there's no patches left unsalted on the grid network. So actually the fleet actually overlap and turn back on themselves. So there's lots of things that have been done to try and do that. Maybe Alan, I don't know if you have any other things that might have.
Yeah, well, I suppose to probably pick up on a couple of points there. You asked firstly, what we do on untreated roads, and Mark mentioned there, for example, salt bins and grit piles. But we also undertake what we call secondary gritting, which is when sort of the condition of the normal salted route is assured, we will send the gritters out to do other routes, for example, routes to rural schools, things like that. There's quite a list of those. We also provide gritting the likes of emergencies or unforeseen circumstances such as funerals, assistance to emergency services, and those sorts of things. What else could we do? You asked about alternatives. There are alternatives. There's things like potassium acetate or urea, but so firstly, they're chemicals. Do we really want to be spreading thousands of tons of chemicals? But not only that, the gritting fleet would have to be changed. They're spreads of liquid rather than dry salt. So yes, there are alternatives. For example, potassium acetate, they use it in the airports, but it's a very confined site and suits what they do. For things like that, it's not just as black and white as maybe it can be made out to be. We do other things. And so we do continually look at ways of improving the service, increasing efficiency. But I suppose it doesn't necessarily mean that even we do improve efficiency, that it would create an increase to the gritting network. It just means we could do it maybe more efficiently or at less cost. So those things are continually ongoing.
Councillor Alexander, was all your points covered, or have you anything to follow up? Okay, thank you, thank you. Councillor Ian Wilson, if you just unmute and start speaking.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, for that, man. Yes, just to really possibly going over a wee bit of ground there was been covered as regards grit piles on some of our rural roads. It's an issue that we get all the time whenever the winter weather hits and the roads are bad, that once them piles have been exhausted, it's a handling now to try and get the grit piles replenished again. Is there any possibility of increasing the number of grit piles or increasing the volume of them? Like I represent Banbridge DA, right, and it's running right from Rathfriland to Guildford. And I appreciate our rural community do go out and grit their own roads, especially the farmers. If the weather really turns bad with snow, they'll go out with their shovels and stuff and try and get the roads possible for their neighbours. And the other issue with the grit piles is with regards to farming community. A lot of dairy farmers have to grit their section of road to make sure the tankers can get in. So I think maybe even having a look at the grit piles, increasing them, or the more frequency along the roads might be a bit of a help. Thank you, Lord Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Mark or Alan, who wants to take that one? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Look, there's no doubt to say that I think Mark provided a figure there of 55,000 grit piles. Within Southern Division, we provide, I think it's somewhere close to 23,000 of that. The vast majority, so maybe 10 to 12,000 of them are in Armagh, Banbridge and Craigavon. And it is a considerable exercise, to put them out first of all at the start of the season, but then to try and replenish them during the season. I think Mark mentioned it can take up to, it can be exhausted within two days, maybe less, depending on the circumstances. But then, because of our limited resources, and we have to remember it's the same people who are driving the gritters that we're trying to use to replenish grit piles and salt boxes and all these sorts of things. So it can take 6-8 weeks after the cold spell to replenish them. So it's not a simple matter of use them today, replace them tomorrow. It just simply isn't feasible. Things, yes, we could consider increasing the size and the number, but again, say 12,000 or 22,000 in the division is already a considerable undertaking, and to consider putting it out more again would only really add to the burden. And I suppose I should say there are lots of them that are very rarely used in any event, and maybe that's not the popular thing to be saying, but I don't know what percentage of them are never used or rarely. So there's a balance that's supposed to be struck between providing more and providing, the service that we do.
Councillor Wilson, are you just nod if you're content with that, or do you want to come back? You're content. Okay. Next on the list then is Councillor O'Kane.
Well, Mark, thanks for the presentation, and the difficult, realise the difficult job that you actually have, But I just want to ask if the assembly was back up and running, would that make things a bit easier for you?
Is that Mark or Alan's going to take that one? Okay, Mark, thank you.
A good question. If we review and change any policy, it would need to go to the minister, because all our policies are minister need the approval of the minister, particularly significant changes. And this one in particular will need if there's a change to it, it will need the executive to give approval. the consideration, the need for the Assembly to come back would only be needed if there was a need to actually put in place and push the button to save money. If there was a decision by a minister to take a decision to reduce our winter service in an effort to save money to meet our budgetary pressures, then that's when we would need the Assembly to be back, the executive to be back. But if there's no, if the minister decides that there's no change needed, then obviously we just continue doing what we're doing. I could go on, but I'd rather just stop.
You're not going to stray from winter policy here, Mark. Mark. Okay. All right. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, and thank you, Mark and Alan, for coming here this evening. It's just maybe on more of the staffing issues. I know that in years previous, and so this year there was problems with gritting not being done due to staff shortages. I know the start of this year was due to strikes, but in previous years that has been the case. How are we looking coming into this winter gritting season, and what contingencies are in place to ensure that we have the staff on the ground? Thank you.
Yourself, Mark? Yes.
Good question. At the start of every, or just before the start of every winter season, like now, is that there is a lot of work being done in the background to make sure the fleet is in good condition and in good working order, that the rotas are in place for drivers, that the duty supervisors who manage the depots for salting actions to make sure the grit gets into the gritter, to make sure the duty controllers who are the decision makers in terms of when to salt and when not to salt, the Met Office information and contracts to be able to give us the detailed information to make those decisions, very difficult decisions. That's all being done now. We are currently preparing for the 1st of October, and the winter season ends at the end of April. So in normal circumstances, we wouldn't have an issue. But as you may be aware, there is and there has been since spring or early last year, ongoing industrial action. Now, we don't know what industrial action is going to happen from the 1st of October onwards. We don't know the impact of what that will be for potentially drivers. We don't know if any industrial action will also conflict with poor weather, for example, because industrial action might happen whenever there is no reduction in temperatures to frost. So it's very difficult to know. But what we do as a department is, and what we did at the end of last season, because we had industrial action last season, is that the senior officials across the department met at that stage every day in the morning to agree what the strategy was for gritting action based on the weather forecast, to take a pragmatic decision of when best to grit and what's best for the public to mitigate and to provide the safest road that's possible. So I suppose what I would say is we're very well connected internally. There's a lot of work done in the background to discuss and communicate. Alan is at the core of that. I'm involved, and so are the other 3 divisional roads managers and the other equivalent of Alan, plus our internal O&M teams. So there's probably and directors, of course, they're all involved in that decision-making process if we have industrial action to make conscious decisions to provide the best service we can for the public.
Right. Thank you, Mark, for that. Councillor Armstrong, you coming back on that? Okay. Hopefully briefly.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for letting me come back in, Lord Mayor. really appreciate your answer. It sort of covered what I was looking to know. I'm going to bring you back to something you said earlier on about, I think it was a statistic that most serious accidents are done on roads that are gridded. I think that's what you said. Is that something to look at from a DFI perspective coming in? Not now, obviously, it's probably too late, but an education on that, and that how to that when we're driving on gridded roads, that to be still as careful as on gridded roads. Is that something that the DFI could look into?
Mark, okay.
Yes, we can. I only learnt of that this morning. And, you know, there is the possibility of even talking to our press office and trying to actually give media messages out. And we do, and actually going back to my previous answer, we do provide media messages during strike action and risks, whatever. But maybe there's something that we could do with our press office to try and put more tweets out, try media out about trying to raise the awareness. So yes, it's a good idea.
Right. Alderman Greenfield, if you just want to unmute online.
Yeah. Thank you, Lord Mayor, and thank you both for your presentation. I suppose just as back to something Alan said there, which I probably wasn't aware of, that Alan, you'd mentioned that once the roads are done on a certain level, you do then go to secondary roads. I think was the word you called it, maybe in schools. But trying to ask a question around that, Alan, is there anything in place that over a prolonged period of a cold spell, you know, for quite a few areas that don't traditionally get gridded, is there something in place, you know, if, when you're talking about secondary roads going and doing schools, which I think is good, but is there something in place there that you do then go to some of these other areas that are maybe in a prolonged spell with some of the smaller roads and more rural locations? Thank you, Lord Mayor.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I suppose, yes, we do. In terms of the rural schools, you know, we would, based on the forecast, we would make a proactive decision that, for example, you know, there's going to be ice on the minor roads tomorrow morning. Well, we would treat the route to schools sort of in the early hours of the morning along with the rest of the network, so that at least whenever the school opens, people can get there. We also have, I suppose, lists or schedules of roads which we know that traditionally create problems that are, you know, hilly in nature, for example, and that we would proactively go and do those. So it's not an extensive list, and it depends very much on the circumstances, but you say we do, and we do know from previous experience the roads that people contact us about looking for, you know, assistance on a regular basis. So yeah, you know, it's some of it's proactive, but again, it can be reactive depending on the circumstances.
Alderman Greenfield, could you give me a thumbs up, or do you want to come back in?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ron. We're just very briefly, sort of the point maybe was saying, so there's nothing sort of specifically that after so many days of a prolonged spell that more rural roads will be done. It sort of was what I was trying to gauge.
No, it doesn't. It's not based on time. It's based purely on the forecast and the weather conditions. Say, obviously, it has to be that the condition of the main salting schedule is sort of in reasonable condition before we would determine to go elsewhere. So it can be the case, for example, that where you have, you know, long periods of snow or freezing rain, etc., that, you know, we simply can't leave the main roads to go to these other routes. But if we have the resources and there's a break in the weather, if you call it that, we would proactively go and do that. But there's no fixed time scale that it has to be ice for several days or whatever it may be.
Alderman Greenfield, yep, thumbs up. Okay, thank you. Councillor Kyle Savage.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Thanks, Mark and Alan, for your presentation tonight. Look, Lagan River is one of those vast rural areas, and many problems, many minor roads and that, but one of the big problems is this. Would you say one of your priorities to sustain the economy? Well, that includes your primary schools, your rural schools, and all of that. And I think it is a priority that these routes are done. So it is. You talk about being reactive. We need a proactive way to dealing with this situation. Reactive is dealing with something that's already happened. We need to be proactive in the build up to this. And indeed, within the rural communities with dairy farmers, that has already been mentioned here tonight, and many farmers go out and clear the roads themselves. Do you coordinate anything with the local farming community? Have you connected with the farmers union, which I think you used to do in the past? But different things they got, I think it's all about being proactive. Yes, you have limited resources, which I appreciate, and I certainly wouldn't like to be the next minister it'll be in, but that's a decision for a higher house in here. So it is, but I think restocking grit piles and grit boxes and all has always been a problem. And whenever you get into for a sustained period cold spell, the footpaths, I know that council can grit the footpaths, but that has to be with your permission, I believe, if I'm right. Well, maybe somebody has misled me on that then. So apologies if they have. But I think these things are also important because that keeps the economy going through sustained cold spells. But I think it's very important. And I see we get the phone calls like all our colleagues in the area about the state of the rural roads and access to the schools and the care, and the people that care for those within the rural communities suffer greatly. So that I was there out at all hours trying to help and protect our most vulnerable within our society. So I suppose you have a duty of care for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Savage and Mark Allen. So what coordination do we do with the farming community? And the other was about reiterating to us about the policy on the footpath, the gritting of the footpath. Isn't that the two questions? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose first of all, the footpath question. We have a memorandum of understanding with each of the 11 councils, which includes a schedule of busy those town centre footpaths to be treated. I suppose you made the comment there that the council needs our permission, if you like. It's not so much that, it's that we would, in a lot of cases, ask the council for assistance. But again, councils like ourselves have other work activities, and it's not always the case that each council can react, or maybe not to the extent that we or indeed the public would expect. But we do keep, close contact with council officials, and we do have arrangements and contact numbers and all those sorts of things in advance of the season, so that if there's a spell of weather forecast or indeed something unforeseen happens, well, then we do contact our contacts in the council. And that's not to say that council officials don't come to us as well, looking for, if you could supply salt, we could do X, Y, and Z. So, it happens both ways. As regards farmers, we have arrangements, or well, contracts isn't the right word, but we have arrangements with farmers for snow clearance, for example. There are a number in each of the council areas, and so we use those as and when. We also have, I suppose, informal arrangements with some farmers that we know, for example, have problems with getting milk deliveries out or in or whatever it may be. We do provide them with salt and grit somewhere where they can use, or indeed they can spread it themselves. So, there are informal arrangements that we do use and have been used for years and work successfully. I can't think of any specifically here, but I can think of some whenever I was back in my Western Division days. So, it does happen, maybe not on a huge scale, but, the facility's there if there's a particular issue or concern that we can do something about.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, for letting me back in. Yes, I'll appreciate that, but is those negotiations, are those conversations happening with the farmers union now, or with the farmers? Because you talk about your Western days, but I live the Southern Division here, so I don't really worry about the rest. Let's be honest.
I wouldn't. The conversations are happening probably at a very local level. The local staff, the local section office staff know the roads that give problems. They know the farmers are not just farmers, but people who be on every winter looking for assistance. So yes, those arrangements are in place, but in terms of a wider scale arrangement, we don't really have discussions with the farmers union as such. to be honest, and I'm not aware that there have been any in the past, but it doesn't mean it's not something we wouldn't explore if there was a benefit or, you know, something could be gained from it.
Councillor Radcliffe.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, and thanks to Mark and Alan for their report. I represent the constituents of the rural Cusher area, and I'm concerned as well and frustrated, to be honest, at the amount of times that school children can't get to their schools. You know, their parents have jobs to go to, and I think it's very important that the rural areas are protected. And I'm going to be honest, DFI really have been very lucky that they've been blessed with mild winters. There was only the real bad winter recently, but it doesn't seem to make any difference to, you know, the rural areas, how they're being protected. And Alan had a point there, mentioned about there's areas there where grit's being left and it isn't being used. So is there no way you can go and do a report of that and maybe put grit elsewhere where it is being used? Because if there's grit sitting there all winter and it isn't being used, obviously nobody's needing it, you know. So that would be one point I'd like to make. Second point would be Councillor Alexander's point earlier, the reduced cover. I still haven't really got an explanation where that's going to be and how that's going to hit, you know, the area going forward. And if you could maybe address that, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Radcliffe. Mark or Alan? Alan, okay, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I suppose first of all, picking up, you know, on the grit piles not being used, you know, we do and can from our client system, we can run reports of where we get requests for replenishment of grit piles, you know, through the season. So we do tend to target those first so that we know those are the ones that are being used, and we proactively, you know, try and keep the areas, particularly the sorts of low-lying areas that maybe don't use grit piles, but we don't tend to provide them at least with the same urgency, if you like. In terms of the strike action cover, I think as Mark has already said, it is very difficult until you know when the strike's happening, and then you see who actually turns up or doesn't turn up for work. But you know, there are, I suppose, if you like, contingency arrangements in place. You know, for example, last winter, whenever the strike did happen, instead of having a PM gritting rota and an AM, we only had sufficient staff and cover to do one action, and it was the morning that, you know, we were able to provide enough people for the morning rota for every route. But you know, as I say, it's very difficult until you know how many staff you have, and unfortunately, as apart from that, it doesn't always impact every area equally. You know, some areas can be much worse affected than others. Some places may be able to deliver full service, others not so. So it depends very much, and it can be reactive to the particular circumstances.
Councillor Radcliffe, would you like to come in again, or are you content? Okay, thank you. Alderman Moutray.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, and thank you both for your attendance tonight, gentlemen. I'm sure it's probably as depressing for you to deliver a downbeat report like that as it is for us to hear it, but that's where we are. Can I just delve a wee bit into, you made reference to a memorandum of understanding with council, and that's of interest to me. So how does that fare in relation to the gritting of town centre footpaths in a frosty spell? And we have been very fortunate this past few years to have had mild weather, but if we get a prolonged bad spell, people have got to get out and about in the town centres, and the footpaths can become pretty bad. I'm led to believe, rightly or wrongly, that in the past DFI provided grit and insurance, and council provided the manpower. Does that still happen in relation to town centre footpaths?
I'll speak to them afterwards. No, look, as already said, there is an MOU with each of the councils, and I suppose it's a bit of a two-way process. There is a schedule of roads or footpaths which we do treat. Now, generally, we don't approach councils if it's just generally frosty conditions. That's if there's ice or snow or things like that. But the arrangement essentially is that we will provide the grit to the council and they will use their manpower to spread it. But because the council and their staff are generally working on our behalf, they can use our defence, if you like, against public liability claims and such like. So they're using our indemnity, if you like, rather than their own insurance or whatever the councils have.
Thank you for that, Alan. Can I just come back then and we're trying to think outside the box here, and you've referred to the use of volunteers as well. Can I push it further and ask, if we had a prolonged spell, is there a possibility that consideration would be given to dump piles in areas, dump piles of grit, if we had a prolonged spell, you're talking 7 days or more, to try and help people out?
Well, for example, we do, where there is space at gates and whatnot, we do provide supplies of grit and salt for members of the public to come and use and take away with them, if you like. It doesn't always suit depending on the amount of space there is at depot gates and what have you, but we do things like that. If we have, I think last winter there were a couple of occasions where we were approached by council officials and we did provide grit piles, I think in couple of the car parks where people could come and use. So, there is that two-way conversation goes on that we can if the demand's there.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I mean, that's what I want to hear, that there's collaboration between our council and yourselves and the Ulster Farmers Union or whoever else out there to try that if we get a bad spell here, that everybody's pulling together to try and make the most of it. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Alderman Moutry and Alan, for that. Councillor O'Dowd is online. If you just want to unmute and start with your question. Councillor O'Dowd, you just start speaking.
Yes, sorry. Councillor O'Kane had made a reference to the Assembly earlier on, and I was kind of skimmed over, if a minister was there, then, he could change, or she could change policy and that. But surely if a minister was there, there would be a better budget, or maybe I'm wrong. Can somebody elaborate on that, please?
Alan or Mark? Which one? Okay, Mark.
Good question. The department's my understanding, and I'm not a financial guru. My understanding is the Department of Finance to the NIO provide the budget for each of the 9 departments. The minister, if there was a minister in place, an executive in place, I can only presume that they would be able to provide influence to that, but I'm not certain. The minister's role would be to make those priority decisions as to where the money that the department receives should be spent, or allocated in terms of, because we have a whole series of complex budget lines that feed in to provide allocations against certain measures. Winter service actually is not included in the baseline budget at the start of the year. We have to bid for it. So we're in the process of bidding for funding now. We haven't yet got it. But the minister would be there to split the funding out, capital funding and resource. And the difference being capital is the money that we would spend to improve the asset value. So resurfacing, for example, improves the asset value of the road. So it's capital. New improvement work such as junctions or lights, all capital monies. So the amount of work that can be done in 1 year will depend on how much money is put into that each of those lines. And the same with resource. The challenge for the last number of years, since 2015, has actually been the amount of resource allocation on the budget line for maintenance work. Let me just call it potholes. Since 2015, there's been a limited service put in place. And it's those 8 years of reduction in spending to fix the maintenance activities that really is now, we're beginning to see visually that the roads are beginning to crumble. That we've said that in media messages before, and we're now becoming more vocal on that. And having a minister in place would firstly decide if more money could be made towards maintaining our current asset, making that a priority, and of course influence the budget, potentially get more money for the department to improve our existing road network. I hope that answers.
Yes, Mark, but you were nearly going down a rabbit hole there that I was going to have to pull you out of. When you started potholes, you were starting a totally different meeting there. Councillor O'Dowd, I've offered a comeback to every other councillor. Would you like to add anything to that?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. The thing I would have, yes, you're saying about the potholes and everything else, but surely a budget as a whole is going to help the whole department. Am I wrong there? Or I understand, don't get me wrong, I totally understand there's different departments within DFI, but a budget, a larger budget, is going to help if the assembly was up and running.
Yeah, I think the point has been well made, Councillor O'Dowd. I appreciate you raising it, and that's a few times tonight it has been raised. So, Councillor McConville Walker, would you like to unmute and raise your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, for letting me in there. So I noticed that rural is a common theme tonight, and in particular schools. I, in fact, had an email from a principal today of a rural school of a road that very, very rarely would be gridded. And quite a few of the parents have spoke to me about this. I mean, they're already starting to worry what's going to happen when the school bus isn't able to get to the school. The school comes down a bit of a slope, and quite a few of them do live a good bit away from the school, should I say. So therefore, you know, they're not going to feel safe driving on the road either if the bus isn't able to go on it. So my question really is, because I'd like to be able to go back to these principals and parents that are contacting me, how do you prioritise these first as part of your secondary gritting that you mentioned that was available? Obviously, emergencies like accidents and stuff, and to assist emergency services must be prioritised. And what would you advise principals and parents of those schools that this may be a regular occurrence? How would they go about reporting that to yourselves, and what is it that you would advise them to possibly have in place? And thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks for the question. I suppose whenever the criteria for, you know, what was a rural school or which one would we provide treatment to, I think it's probably about 10 or 11 years ago, after a sustained period of ice and a lot of school closures. A lot of the rural schools that are on that schedule, if you like, were schools that had sustained several days of closures over several years. Now, it didn't always mean that every school was added. In fact, at the time, not every school responded. There was a questionnaire sent out. And I suppose in the intervening period, a lot of those schools have actually closed. But, you know, if there is a particular school that, you know, is experiencing difficulties, we can quite happy to take a look at it again and see if there is anything we can do to provide a service. But I suppose I'd also take you back to the point that Mark made earlier, that, you know, if you provide salt or grit on a road with very little traffic on it, particularly early morning, and that, you know, that's, you know, at the end of the day, the school traffic is sort of 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning. If you grit the road at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and there's no traffic on it until 7, maybe 8 o'clock, well, the salt, I think probably everybody has seen if you take a footpath that the road has been gritted adjacent to it, you'll see the salt grain sitting on the footpath, but the size of your thumbnail almost. If there's no traffic on it, that's what the salt does. It just sits on the road until there's traffic. And there are examples of low traffic roads, and the same thing happens around Christmas periods or holiday periods. And indeed during COVID, when there's little traffic, the people out on the road first thing in the morning, for example, the school traffic, the school bus, whatever, the salt may be down, but it isn't effective. And it can be 9, 10 o'clock in the morning until there's a reasonable volume of traffic before it actually becomes effective. So, in theory, you could provide all the salt in the world, but it may not have the desired effect in terms of getting children on the school buses to the school.
Councillor McConville Walker, would you like to come back in, or are you content? Just give me a thumbs up or start to speak if you want to come back. You okay? Okay, thank you. Members, can I just thank everyone for your questions, and I do appreciate and I thank you all for keeping to the topic in hand. The questions were not repetitive. They were all very genuine concerns. I thank Mark and Alan for coming in tonight, being honest with us and trying to keep it as understanding as we can. I would imagine you share our frustrations. And I do appreciate your time and for coming in tonight for this just this special meeting. And members, again, thank you for your time. Safe home on the roads. And that's us concluded business. Thank you.